The roads became nothing but canals of bottomless mud, along which our vehicles could advance only at a snail's pace and with great wear to the engines. Wheeled vehicles could advance with the help of tracked vehicles. These, performing tasks for which they were not intended, rapidly wore out. By the 14th of October 1941, the forces of Operation Typhoon had struggled through a week of torrential rains and tenacious Russian resistance to reach the historical battleground of Brodino. They were now just 100 kilometers from their ultimate goal, the capture of Moscow. Advancing painfully through the quagmire of the Russian autumn, the tired Germans began to face a quality of Soviet unit they had not previously encountered. The crack division of 32nd Rifles had been transferred to the defense of Moscow from the eastern outreaches of Siberia. Containing 2 tank brigades armed with the revolutionary T-34 tank and fully supported by anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons, the Siberians initially provided an effective windbreak to the diminishing fury of Operation Typhoon. But 5 days later, the sheer weight of the German advance had overwhelmed them. In the nerve center of the Soviet Union, the proximity of the German armies threw the inhabitants into total disarray. Mass evacuations were organized while some citizens simply fled of their own accord. Even Stalin and his government prepared to abandon their capital. In one of the most dramatic incidents of the war, Stalin left his waiting train and, after pacing manically up and down the station platform, decided that the government would remain. A state of siege was declared, and a decree of the 19th of October stated that all provocateurs, all spies and other agents of the enemy are to be shot on the spot. The remaining citizens of Moscow were scoured for recruits to a civil reserve force, which was hastily mobilized to the front. Stalin now learned from his spies in Japan that the Japanese government did not intend to attack in the east. Freed of the nightmare of war on a second front, he ordered the transport of 22 fresh divisions of well-equipped Siberian forces to Moscow. But time was running out. By the first week of November, the Germans had advanced another 20 kilometers. Tanks and vehicles were still being sucked into roadways no better than swamp tracks. The Germans prayed for the frosts to come to harden them. When the freeze finally arrived, they wished their prayers had been ignored. The November frosts came late but sharp. General Guderian had earlier requested winter supplies, but had been rebuked for negative thinking. The Germans began to find a concrete use for the propaganda leaflets they had been issued with, stuffing them into their uniforms to keep the cold at bay. In Moscow, Stalin struggled to kindle the flame of citizen morale by staging the traditional Revolution Day parade, despite the dangers of aerial bombardment. In his speech at Lenin's tomb, he again appealed to the ancient Russian tradition of heroism in the face of adversity. The war you are waging is a war of liberation, a just war. May you be inspired in this war by the heroic figures of our great ancestors. While the remaining inhabitants greeted this speech with muted enthusiasm, the Germans crept closer. Hitler had insisted that his armies should divide and approach Moscow from the north and south simultaneously. By the end of November, they were only 30 kilometers from their target. The spires of the Kremlin were tantalizingly within their gaze. But Hitler's arrogance in failing to provide winter supplies was now disastrously limiting their progress. Without antifreeze, motor vehicles would not start and planes could not fly. Without winter clothing, frostbite claimed the limbs of tens of thousands of the advancing army. Guns refused to fire. Food refused to thaw. When it did, soup froze on the spoon. Guderian later wrote of the endless expanse of Russian snow during this winter of our misery, the icy wind that blew across it, the shelters too thin, badly clothed, half-starved men. The campaign medal later awarded to the veterans of the Russian winter came to be known as the Order of the Frozen Flesh. On the 5th of December, the harrying of the still advancing German forces by night raids and daytime sorties became a concerted counterattack. For those consistently retreating before the German armies, it was difficult to orientate themselves towards this sudden offensive. We had thought first we will halt the enemy, marshal our reserves, prepare for attack, and finally throw ourselves upon them. The reality turned out harsher and more exacting. We simply had to turn our left shoulder around and attack the enemy under whose pressure we had been retreating until yesterday. In a final assault which had begun on the 1st of December, the Germans came as close as 15 kilometers to Moscow. Zhukov's western front then began to drive back the northern arm of their encirclement. And southern front halted Guderian's forces around Tula to the south. Mobile groups of Russians destroyed fuel dumps and artillery deep behind the German lines. The troops of the Third Reich now faced fully equipped Russian infantry, snugly clad in their felt boots and greatcoats. Harried by ski battalions, they watched their enemies' T-34 tanks crash through snow and woodland, while their own panzers sluggishly negotiated the roadways. German morale wilted. The hard-pressed soldiers, most of them still clad in their summer uniforms and tight leather boots, fell back rapidly, often abandoning huge caches of equipment in their haste. Encouraged by their breakthrough, the Russian High Command attempted to turn the German tactics on themselves and encircle their entire army group center. Despite Hitler's orders to stand firm, by the end of the year, the Germans had withdrawn up to 150 kilometers from Moscow. Generals Guderian and Herpner had been dismissed for retreating without permission. Von Blumenritt, commander of the Fourth Army, described how the German situation might have been even worse. I and my staff spent Christmas Day in a small hut, with Tommy guns on the table and the sound of shooting all around us. Just as it seemed that nothing could save us from being cut off, we found that the Russians were moving on westwards, instead of turning up north astride our rear. The Russian counterattack was further strengthened by the reinstatement of officers condemned to the prison camps during Stalin's Great Purges. They were ferocious warriors. As the wounded commander of the 222nd Rifles told his German interrogators, "If a man has a penal camp behind him, death holds no terror for him." Less distinguished prisoners were released into penal battalions which performed the most dangerous tasks, such as clearing minefields and storming strongpoints. The casualty rate in these battalions was the highest in the Red Army, but prisoners still volunteered for military service. The death rate in the camps had increased sevenfold since 1940. In the south, German progress was also being stymied. Timoshenko massed 22 divisions of the Red Army against the 1st Panzer Group, which had captured Rostov, the communications center of the Dnieper Basin. Cut off from the potential reinforcement of the 17th Army to the north, the 1st Panzer Group were forced to fall back more than 70 kilometers. Hitler sacked von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group South, and ordered an immediate halt to the retreat. Only when he had reviewed the position at first hand did Hitler accept that withdrawal had been the only possible option. At Leningrad, food supplies to the besieged city had been worsening throughout the autumn. By late November, they were at their lowest ebb of the whole siege. Manual workers were receiving only 250 grams of bread per day, 1/3 of their normal requirement. Without water for sanitation and basic medical supplies, disease became rampant. As temperatures fell to the -20s, thousands began to die each day. Total starvation threatened constantly. To the Germans, collapse seemed imminent. Back in Berlin, a reception with Adolf Hitler as guest of honor was organized to celebrate the fall of the stricken city. The invitations were printed, but never posted. The Russians marked a road across the frozen southwest corner of Lake Ladoga, and by the 22nd of November, convoys of lorries were barely staving off famine in the city. It was a hazardous passage through the biting northeastern gales which swept across the lake. Alexander Meshirov, the poet, vividly remembered the journey across the frozen wasteland. What a road. A nightmare horror, that road. Of all my roads, the worst. What a road, running into the thick of the blockade with only the sky above. Yet for all its horror, the Russians knew that defending this lifeline to the city was the only possibility of keeping the inhabitants alive. I'll never need to be urged to attack, whether the fire falls heavy or no. Ladoga's ice in my eyes looms black, with Leningrad children dead in the snow. But the food coming across the ice was too little, too late for some. Victims of starvation, suffering from falling blood pressure and the wasting of the heart and internal organs, would never regain their health. Many would die months after food and medical supplies finally arrived. The children who survived would emerge totally traumatized by the siege. It was reflected in the way many of the children played all by themselves, in the way that even in their collective games they played in silence with grave faces. I saw faces of children which reflected such thoughtfulness and sorrow that those eyes and faces told one more than could be gathered from all the stories of the horrors of famine. It wasn't until the Red Army retook Tikhvin on December the 9th, opening a rail link with the city, that the situation in Leningrad eased. In the far north, Hitler's attentions had been fixed on closing the all-weather port of Murmansk, through which Russia could be supplied by naval convoys from Britain. Winter conditions around Moscow were balmy compared to those of the primordial terrain surrounding Murmansk. General Dietl, commander of Mountain Corps Norway, informed Hitler that the landscape up there in the tundra outside Murmansk is just as it was after the creation. There's not a tree, not a shrub. No human settlement, no roads and no paths. In the summer, it's a swamp. In the winter, there's ice, snow, and it's 40 to 50 degrees below. Icy gales rage throughout the 8 months of the Arctic night. By the end of 1941, the Germans had made virtually no progress. The port of Murmansk was still open, and communications with Central Russia still intact. As the new year approached, there was every reason for Stalin to feel optimistic about the outcome of the war. The German blitzkrieg had slowed to a crawl, halted, and was now grinding into reverse. It also seemed that the great exodus of industry to the east had been successfully accomplished. While the next 3 months would prove critical, the economic war had been put on a sound footing. The eastern industrial enclaves rapidly became the cornerstone of the Russian war effort. The instant expansion of the Ural, Siberian and Kazakhstan centers of production in the first year of the war was nothing short of miraculous. 360 large enterprises, mainly war enterprises, were evacuated to the eastern regions of the USSR. On land, the T-34 tank was now becoming standard, to the dismay of the German panzer groups. When the first of these medium tanks was met by the 17th Panzers, they found that their shells simply bounced off its heavy sloped armor, while its high-velocity 76mm turret gun proved devastating. It ploughed through the advancing Germans for 9 miles before being halted by a field artillery howitzer at short range. The T-34 was the most successful tank design of the entire war. Its powerful diesel engine enabled it to sail over terrain that the panzers balked at. The T-34 seemed capable of constant modification and improvement. The barrel of its 76mm gun was lengthened to strengthen its armor-piercing capability. Later, its firepower was further increased by arming a larger turret with an 85mm gun adapted from anti-aircraft usage. The T-34's armor was also upgraded to 110mm on the front and 90mm around the turret. Over 40,000 T-34s would be produced before the war was over. But despite Soviet optimism, the war was far from nearing its end. The Russian defenders had paid a terrible price for their resistance, and the toll in human terms would continue for the next 3 years. The Soviet casualties in the first 6 months of the invasion had been staggering. It was only 50 years later that it would be admitted that 1.5 million troops had perished in the defense of Moscow alone. Many of those who were taken prisoner by the Germans fared worse than the dead. The German High Command alleged that the Russians had refused to abide by the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war and encouraged German troops to seek revenge on such barbarous subhumans. The Soviet Union had in fact undertaken to observe the Geneva Protocols, and through neutral Sweden had requested that Germany do the same. Germany's response was to shoot Russian prisoners out of hand, to gas them, starve them, and deprive them of the medical supplies necessary for their survival. Many were crammed into rail carts and left in sidings to perish. Others were force-marched until they died from exhaustion. more were simply exposed to the deadly cruelties of the Russian winter. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners had been murdered by 1942, and this was to set an horrendous trend which would continue throughout the course of the war. Even some of the German soldiers, like Guy Sayer, were sickened by the treatment of Russian prisoners. In the autumn of 1942, a locomotive appeared in the distance. It was entirely blacked out. What I saw next froze me with horror. The first of the flat cars to pass my uncomprehending eyes seemed to be carrying a confused heap of objects, which only gradually became recognizable as human bodies. Directly behind this heap, other people were clinging together, crouching or standing. Hals looked at me. Except for the burning red spots made by the cold, his face was as white as a sheet. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "They've piled up their dead to shield themselves from the wind." Every car was carrying a shield of human bodies. I stood as if petrified by the horror of the sight rolling slowly by. Faces entirely drained of blood and bare feet stiffened by the cold. The total number of Russian prisoners to be captured would eventually be reckoned at 5.5 million. Of these, only 2 million would survive the inhuman treatment of their captors. Of the rest, many would be murdered during the first few weeks of their captivity, while 2 million would perish in the notorious concentration camps of the Reich. Hermann Goering told Ciano, Mussolini's envoy, that Russian prisoners, having been forced to eat the soles of their boots, had then resorted to cannibalism and, which is more serious, had also eaten a German sentry. Some nations must be decimated. There is nothing to be done about it. The paltry figure of 3.5 million slaughtered Russian POWs was a drop in the ocean for Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. Himmler's plans for the new order in Europe envisaged the reduction of its Slav population by at least 30 million. It was Himmler and his deputy Heydrich who were the real masters of occupied Russia. Field Marshal Keitel, when asked why the supposedly civilized commanders of the German army allowed the barbarities of the Russian invasion to occur, protested that even the commander-in-chief of the army did not have the executive power or authority to issue and enforce laws in the occupied East. This prerogative belonged strictly to Heydrich and Himmler, who had de facto discretionary powers over the life and death of population and prisoners, including prisoners of war. Yet there is abundant evidence of German field commanders only too willing to aid and abet the murderous pogroms of the SS. Himmler's sinister men in black, the Schutzstaffel, or SS, became the supreme rulers of Western Russia. Even before Barbarossa, the SS had discussed with the army officers how they could be facilitated in the campaign of terror they were to unleash in the wake of the invasion. In May 1941, 4 Einsatzgruppen were formed with the primary aim of eliminating the ideological opponents of the Reich. Soviet officials, commissars and Jews were to be rounded up and shot to death. In the event, those who were dispatched swiftly by a bullet were the fortunate. Local Jewish leaders in Russia were forced to assemble their people in designated areas. From these collection points, they were transported to killing fields, where they were stripped of their clothing and riddled with machine gun fire. The sheer numbers involved often meant that the wounded were also tipped into the burial pits and covered up to suffocate. At Kiev, in September 1941, over 33,000 Jews were murdered in a single operation, which lasted 2 days. In Pinsk, the carnage was accomplished with the use of grenades, dogs, axes, and the cavalry of the SS. It was difficult, demanding work, and soldiers were rewarded with treble pay and long holidays. Erich Ohlendorf, one of the Einsatzgruppen commanders, boasted that he had personally disposed of 90,000 victims, mainly Jews, in the first year of the war. But it was not only Jews who suffered. Anyone could be accused of being an official or a commissar and summarily executed. German troops were actively encouraged to commit outrage on an occupied population which was to be subjugated by terror. People were brutalized for real or imagined offenses. Despite regulations, women were raped in the streets in full view of horrified onlookers. As well as carrying out this policy of repression and ethnic sanitation, officials in Russia were also obliged to provide forced labor for the German war economy. This allowed male civilians in the Reich to be freed for military service. The German officials in Russia went about the task with an eerie mixture of barbarity and incompetence. Potential recruits were gathered without any discrimination as to their suitability. They were often left unfed for long periods, and conditions on the westbound freight trains which carried them were insanitary and inhuman. Babies born on the journey were ripped out of their mothers' arms and flung onto passing embankments to perish. Not surprisingly, by the end of 1941, 100,000 of those transported from the Ukraine were sent back as unfit to work. Many did not survive the return journey. Those waiting to travel westwards were forced to watch dead comrades being unloaded from the trains they themselves would have to occupy. This treatment of occupied peoples, some of which had welcomed the Nazis as saviors from the tyranny of Stalin, eventually gave rise to resistance movements determined to exact revenge for the brutalities which had been inflicted on them. The atrocities were etched deep into the psyches of those who witnessed them and inspired an implacable hatred for the perpetrators. You will not hear the mother calling from 7,003 kilometers away through the menacing howl of the polar wind in the crush of disasters that surround you. You, my dear, are becoming a wild beast there. You, the last and the first, you are ours. Dispassionate spring wanders over my Leningrad grave. You will hoist me onto a bloody hook like a slain beast, so that foreigners, giggling with disbelief, should wander around and write in learned journals that my incomparable gift had died, that I was a poet of poets, but that 13 o'clock struck for me. On the 5th of January 1942, Stalin ordered a general offensive utilizing 9 of the Soviet Union's 10 front groups. Zhukov's forces were to continue the counterattack in the center. The Crimea was to be retaken. Leningrad was to be freed from the clutches of Army Group North, and the Donetsk Basin was to be recovered from Army Group South. Hitler had now taken over active command of the German armies on the Eastern Front. His priorities gave little confidence to his harassed generals. Anyone can do the little job of directing operations in war. The task of the commander-in-chief is to educate the army to be National Socialist. I do not know any general who can do this as I want it done. I have therefore decided to take over the command of the army myself. In addition, Hitler was losing faith in the commanders who had failed to bring Barbarossa to a successful conclusion. He had already dismissed both the cautious von Rundstedt and the audacious Guderian. The friction between Hitler and his generals became vocal and more rancorous as the winter wore on. Despite this, as the January initiative became bogged down in the spring thaw, Stalin had little to show for an offensive which was so ruthlessly driven that it produced more Russian than German casualties. The Volkov front managed to penetrate von Leeb's Army Group North, but its second shock army were isolated at the spearhead of the penetration and the attack was repulsed. Further south, Northwest Front encircled 90,000 men of von Leeb's army in an 800-mile area near Demyansk. However, in a heroic operation, which won the personal praise of the Führer, the Luftwaffe managed to stave off a withdrawal by providing the Demyansk pocket with 270 tons of supplies each day, until eventually a corridor was pushed through to relieve the defenders. The 29th Army of the Kalinin Front, which had almost completed an encirclement of a large portion of Army Group Center, was itself surrounded and destroyed. Army Group South managed to contain the bulge that was developing under attack from the Russian south and southwest fronts. In the Crimea, Russian gains were restricted to the Kerch Peninsula. It had been the most brutal winter in living memory, and both sides emerged exhausted. Army General Meretz Skoll wrote, "I will never forget the endless forests, the bogs, the waterlogged peat fields, the potholed roads. The punishing battle with the forces of the enemy that went on side by side with the equally punishing battle with the forces of nature." The German armies emerged from the winter fighting in a state described by General Franz Halder, Hitler's chief of staff, as disastrous. Of the 162 divisions facing the Red Army, only 11 were fully capable of offensive operations. For the 16 Panzer divisions in the east, only 140 serviceable tanks were available, and most divisions were only 20% mobile. Nevertheless, Hitler was determined that a full-scale attack should be resumed. It was a question of advance or retreat. Halder even considered recommending a withdrawal to the pre-war border in Poland. Quite wisely, he never mentioned this to Hitler. If the German armies stepped back, then Russia could regroup her forces, recover her raw materials, and rebuild her Western industries. Hitler had been informed by the economic lobby in Germany that without fresh oil reserves, it could not sustain the war effort. The oil fields of the Caucasus beckoned temptingly. All thoughts of withdrawal were pushed aside. The losses of manpower, vehicles and tanks, which had been suffered since the outbreak of hostilities, could not be fully made good for the new offensive. Infantry divisions were now to total 7 battalions instead of 9. The battle strength of companies was reduced from 180 troops to 80. Between November 1941 and March 1942, only 7,500 vehicles were supplied to replace the 75,000 which had been lost, and fuel oil was in short supply. Mobility had been seriously affected. The panzer divisions, which would take part in the summer offensive in the south, contained barely 135 tanks each. Even this had only been achieved by seriously weakening northern and central divisions. The one weapon that Hitler did have on his side was surprise. Stalin had assumed that Hitler would resume his attack on Moscow and heavily reinforced its defensive reserves. But when the Germans struck on the 8th of May, it was the Crimean front which was torn apart by von Manstein's 11th Army. The German strategy was to clear its flanks for a concerted drive towards the oil fields of the Caucasus. While von Manstein subdued the Crimea, Timoshenko's southwest front, which lay on the northern flank of the drive, was to be destroyed by the 9th and 57th Armies. Ironically, as the Germans prepared to attack Timoshenko, he was busily gathering reinforcements for an offensive which would retake Kharkov. On the 12th of May, with 600,000 men, he launched this operation westwards. Penetration against the German 16th Army was deep and swift, but as the Russian lines of communication lengthened, their flanks became increasingly vulnerable. On the 17th of May, a German attack pierced the armies of the southern front, which was protecting the left flank of the Russian offensive. As Timoshenko turned to respond to this threat, the 16th Army counterattacked his wheeling force on its right flank. When the German encirclement was completed, almost the total reserve of T-34 and KV-1 tanks built up over the winter months was in German hands, along with over 2,000 guns and almost 250,000 prisoners. In the south, von Manstein had by now entered the final phase of his Crimean campaign, and only the fortress of Sevastopol, besieged since the previous year, was under Soviet control. After 250 days of dogged resistance, Sevastopol finally capitulated on the 4th of July. The victorious von Manstein and his troops were ordered north to Leningrad, despite pleas to cross the Kerch Strait and bolster the main offensive. The German forces were now organized into two groups. Army Group B struck eastwards from Kursk to the north and Kharkov to the south, but failed to encircle the retreating Soviet forces. Hitler, convinced that the main body of the Red Army had retreated to the area north of Rostov, ordered a huge encirclement of the city. In doing so, he pulled the 4th Panzer Army away from its advance down the Donetsk corridor towards Stalingrad. It was a fatal mistake. Von Kleist was to write later, "The 4th Panzer Army was advancing on my left. It could have taken Stalingrad without a fight at the end of July, but was diverted south to help me in crossing the Don. I did not need its aid. It merely congested the roads I was using. When it turned north again, a fortnight later, the Russians had gathered just sufficient forces at Stalingrad to check it." After taking Rostov, Army Group A continued along the Black Sea towards the foothills of the Caucasus. Hitler had planned to take Stalingrad and then proceed southwards. He was now committed to achieving both objectives simultaneously. By late August, Army Group A was running into stiff resistance from the newly formed Trans-Caucasus Front, defending the span of the huge mountain chain from the Black Sea to the Caspian. A Russian southeast front was also established to protect the plains to the northeast of the mountains. The Caucasus front contained Georgians, Armenians and Azerians, who were well aware of what a German invasion would mean for themselves and their families. Their resistance was desperate and determined. Approximately half the adult males of Georgia would eventually sacrifice themselves in the bitter struggle for their homeland. Not only was resistance hardening in front of Army Group A, but their strength was constantly being eroded to bolster the battle for Stalingrad to the north. The Caucasian oil wells had been the primary target of the German summer offensive. The taking of Stalingrad was at first simply an obvious target to protect the left flank of Army Group A. Had Stalingrad not been named in honor of the Russian leader, it might have remained a subsidiary target. Hitler began to find the symbolism of its name increasingly difficult to resist. On the 23rd of July, its capture was placed on a par with the southern advance. By September, defeat at the city named after his arch-rival was unthinkable. Stalin, too, was aware of the symbolic significance involved. As early as the 1st of July, with the German 6th Army approaching the Big Bend of the Don and threatening the road to the city, Stalin told Timoshenko, "I order the formation of an army group Stalingrad. The city itself will be defended by the 62nd Army to the last man." At the time of Stalin's order, the 62nd Army were desperately preparing a defensive position at the Clutch bridgehead, west of the Don, supported to the south by the 64th Army and 1st Tank Army. On the 30th of July, the German 6th Army struck north and south of this formation, and by the 8th of August, it was encircled. The remnants of the 62nd and 64th Army pulled back to form a defensive perimeter around Stalingrad, leaving the approach road virtually undefended. On the 23rd of August, the 6th Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, and the 4th Panzer Army crossed the Don and sped toward the city. Despite the resolute defense of the outnumbered Soviet forces, the Germans crashed through the suburbs. Only a rapid withdrawal to the inner city on the 30th of August prevented a complete encirclement of the forward defenses. The depleted Russian ranks were bolstered by the addition of 125,000 adult citizens and 7,000 male youths between the ages of 13 and 17. Workers in the munitions factories handed over weapons and equipment to their soldiers as soon as they came off the production lines. As the battle grew in intensity, they were forced to use them themselves. In their eagerness for a rapid victory, the Germans made a severe tactical error. While the firebombing of the Luftwaffe, which was ordered as a prelude to the final assault, created major structural damage, it also constricted the mobility of the attackers. It turned the struggle for occupation into a Rattenkrieg, a rat's war through the rubble-choked thoroughfares of the city. German tank superiority and aerial dominance counted for very little. The German army's whole tactical training had been concerned with how to avoid such a war of vicious attrition. The defenders, on the other hand, proved adept at this hide-and-seek struggle through the labyrinth of ruined buildings and blocked alleyways to which Stalingrad was reduced. The battle zones contracted to minuscule proportions. In the larger buildings, floors and even stairways were transformed into centers of conflict. Any overview became almost impossible as individual buildings changed hands several times in a single day. Back in Germany, the slow progress of its army gave rise to jokes parodying the official reports from the front. Today, our troops captured a 2-room flat with kitchen, toilet and bathroom. They managed to retain 2/3 of it, despite hard-fought counterattacks from the enemy. Nevertheless, the sheer weight of the German attack began to tell. By mid-September, the defense of the city seemed on the point of being overwhelmed. The result of the war in the East hung once again in the balance. Hitler was disregarding the tactics of Vernichtungsgedanke, the idea of annihilation by swift blows to the flanks and rear, which had been the basis of all German successes to date. He was disregarding the needs of the campaign in the Caucasus by diverting crucial amounts of manpower to Stalingrad. And, totally out of character, he was ignoring the weakness of the German flanks along the 60-mile salient which the attack on Stalingrad had created. Hitler was risking everything in his growing obsession with this one city. The Red Army, pressed back against the Volga with the smoking ruins of Stalingrad in front of them, were once again on the rack. The optimism of the early spring had turned sour in a soul-destroying series of defeats which saw further huge tracts of their homeland fall into enemy hands. Should Stalingrad now capitulate, the blow to their morale would be immense. More ominously, the fall of Stalingrad would seal the fate of the Caucasus and pave the way for the final breach of the only barrier to stand between Nazi Germany and absolute control of the European continent. For all the excesses and brutalities of Stalin's Russia, Stalingrad's collapse would unleash an era of cold-blooded slaughter and mayhem such as the world had never before witnessed. In the words of Joseph Goebbels, "A time of brutality approaches, of which we ourselves have absolutely no conception. In fact, we are in the middle of it. We shall only reach our goal if we have enough courage to destroy, laughingly to shatter what we once held holy, such as tradition, upbringing, friendship, and human love."